Hello and welcome. My name is Elizabeth Kitamura, and today we will be learning about DBCP and the events at the Occidental Chemical Company in Lathrop, California in the late 1970s. This is our purpose and objectives for today's presentation. Today we will learn about DBCP, what it is, what it's for, how it affected these men, and how its production and use was eventually banned in the U.S. We will end with the current exposure guidelines. In July 1977, the U.S. Assistant Secretary of Labor for Occupational Safety and Health received a letter from the U.S. Vice President of the Oil, Chemical, and Atomic Workers International Union, and a health hazard evaluation was requested after the men discovered over a lunch hour conversation that many of the workers were worried about not having children. We will hear from the widow of Michael Trout, pictured here, on the challenges the men faced through sterility later on in our presentation. What is DBCP? It is anticipated to be a human carcinogen due to the evidence from animal studies and first listed in the 1981 Second Annual Report on Carcinogens. It is a very effective nematocide, or a substance that kills nematode worms that target crop roots, and it has a low plant toxicity, so it was used in agriculture throughout the world for crops like citrus, grapes, peaches, pineapples, soybeans, and tomatoes. Commercial names for DBCP include Fumigan, Nemagen, Nemacet, and Nematox. It is a highly combustible material and corrosive to metals. It is usually applied by adding it to irrigation water or by placing it in the ground with a tractor-like wheel. Once it reaches the ground, it fumigates the soil. Unfortunately, protective clothing was recommended for handling DBCP in 1978. Therefore, our Lathrop, California workers were exposed to it with no protection. The U.S. started commercially producing DBCP in 1955, and it quickly increased to producing about 20 million pounds by 1975. At the time of this incident, only 2 companies produced it, including ours, the Occidental Chemical Company. In our factory, you can see the amount that was produced each month from 1968 to 1977. The total amount produced each month over the course of the 10 years is the very top line, which, if a worker worked with DBCP from 1968 to 77, that worker would have been exposed to significant amounts of DBCP. Let us now look more closely at the men affected by exposure to DBCP. The routes of exposure for it include inhalation, dermal contact, and ingestion. What happened at this factory in 1977? A small group of men of reproductive age were producing DBCP and discovered that some were having troubles conceiving after they began producing it. Semen analyses were run, and all men were either azoospermic, which is the complete absence of sperm from the fluid ejaculated during orgasm, or severely oligospermic, which is a condition with low sperm count in the ejaculate. These were troubling results, so an outside medical consultant was hired to examine the entire division where the men were either azoospermic or oligospermic. The workers exposed the longest had the most severely depressed counts, so then another study of the 310 plant employees happened, as you can see from this pie chart, and we will look more closely at the examined group, that 63% of workers, in our next slide. Of the examined men from the previous slide, 107 were exposed to DBCP and 35 were unexposed. In the exposed men, 13.1% were azoospermic and 32.6% were oligospermic. For the non-exposed group, 2.9% were azoospermic and 5.7% were oligospermic. While the air levels of the factory were below the recommended level of the time, after further study, DBCP was determined to be the common exposure and likely cause of the testicular failure according to the final report. When the production of DBCP and subsequent exposure to it ended in July 1977, some of the oligospermic men showed some recovery in their sperm count, but by August 1978, none of the azoospermic men had improved sperm counts. OSHA issued a final standard to limit workers' DBCP exposure to 0.001 parts per million. Included in their final report were further requirements to employers for them to provide initial and annual medical examinations for DBCP exposed workers, respiratory protection, and training. The U.S. EPA permanently prohibited the use of DBCP in November 1979, and it applied to all crops except for pineapples in Hawaii when, in 1985, its use was discontinued there as well. As you can see, the Safe Drinking Water Act and Food and Drug Administration have also issued guidelines for exposure levels to DBCP. In summary, DBCP is a chemical used in agriculture to target the development of nematodes. One can be exposed to it through inhalation, dermal contact, and ingestion. Workers without effective personal protective equipment may suffer from complete loss of semen in their ejaculate or very low counts of semen in their ejaculate, thus creating difficulties conceiving children. The production of DBCP was banned in the U.S. in 1979, and its use in agriculture in the U.S. ended in 1985. As we look at environmental health concerns, we must always keep people front and center. So I end with the memory of Lathrop, California factory worker, 27-year-old Michael Trout, who died from a hemorrhage caused by a brain tumor in December 1979. His wife filed a wrongful death lawsuit against the company, which was eventually settled outside of court. In reflecting on his life and death, she said, "We had been trying from the time my first son was 2 to have another baby. I felt that the sterility thing was harder on him than the cancer. He was crushed, and the whole thing just about destroyed our marriage." May the story of Michael and his wife be forefront in our mind as we continue to protect our global environmental health. Thank you for your time today.